Hey guys, all right, this is the second and last video for chapter 17. If you think back to the video from a couple of days ago, we're in the period called the Middle Ages. All right, we're talking about Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. And as we get into the 500s, 600s, into the thousands, Europe is in this time period called the Middle Ages. And again, it's called the Middle Ages because it's in between the Roman Empire and modern world history, which begins with the Renaissance. All right, so what we're going to be talking about tonight is going to be something called feudalism. All right, feudalism is very important to understanding European history as you go, really, as we go into next year and talk about the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. The idea of feudalism is really going to spark European culture for hundreds of years, and so it's not just for this chapter. It's really something that we're going to be talking about over the next couple of chapters and bringing us into to that modern world history in August. So we're going to get started. And really, feudalism, all it is just a social system. We've been talking about social structures all year long, that every time we get to a civilization or an empire, we talk about the social structure. And usually at the very top is the leader, whether it's a king or a pharaoh. And then usually underneath that is a noble or aristocrat, sometimes priests and warriors. And then at the very bottom, you have basically everybody else: peasants, serfs, farmers, regular people. And really, feudalism is not much different than that. It's pretty much set up the same way. But what is unique about feudalism is how these different classes are going to work with each other to help each other out. And that's something that we really haven't seen hardly any of all year long. So that's what we focused on tonight is looking at the relationship between the different social classes and how it sets up what's called feudalism. All right, so we begin with the king and the queen at the top. Again, as we've seen with pretty much every other civilization. And then underneath them, we have nobles, or as they're also called, lords. Okay, Lords. All right, and the reason that they're called lords is that that's a title that will be given to many nobles. Now, here's how this is going to be broken down. Okay, you have a piece of land that nobles have. Okay, again, nobility or aristocrats many times come from a prestigious family, either have money or land or both. Sometimes it's just a title of aristocracy, usually well educated. And so you have a group of nobles that really during the Middle Ages, nobles in some cases had just as much power as kings and queens. And that's going to be a normal part of European history from the Middle Ages going to the end of the Middle Ages into modern world history, in that nobles and aristocrats in Europe really have a lot of power, and in some cases, even more power than the kings and the queens. But in this case, the nobles might have some land, but they need people to work the land. Okay, the nobles are not going to farm the land themselves, so they need people to work the land. So we're going to begin here by looking at the fact that the nobles are going to have land. Okay, they had land, but who's going to work the land? Okay, well, that's where we bring in our next group, which are going to be knights and warriors. And in this case, they're also called vassals. All right, so the way that this system has been broken down is that the nobles have the land, and what they're going to do is that they're going to hire out the knights to live on the land and to work the land. Okay, so the knights are going to need places to live. They're going to need places to work, places to farm for food. And so the knights need the land. Nobles have the land. And so the nobles are going to somewhat rent out the land or give the land to knights. Now, in turn for that, what they get is protection. Okay, so the knights will get part of the land, and in return, they provide protection for the nobles. Okay, so that if the nobles are attacked, and many times they are, then the knights are there for their protection. Okay, so it's kind of like hiring a group of bodyguards to make sure that you are protected. So nobles would give land to the knights in return for protection. Now that also means that anytime that the nobles go into battle or try to conquer somebody else, anytime they go into war whatsoever, the knights are there to help them out. Okay, and that's part of that agreement. This is a give and take relationship here, and that's exactly what feudalism is based off: is that give and take. Somebody has something, somebody needs something, and so they trade out for it. It's kind of a different version of a trading session. So nobles had the land, and they also needed protection. Which is where the knights come in. All right, so the nobles will give out the land to knights in return for protection. Um, but now the knights have the land, but if the knight is constantly off at war or they're constantly fighting, okay, being a knight, first of all, was meant that you were one of the fiercest warriors in all of Europe. You were highly trained. There was a certain code of conduct that you should follow that we'll talk about here towards the end. You really didn't give knights a lot of time to actually farm the land. So what you have happen here is that you bring in another group of people called peasants, or serfs, and they're the ones that would actually work the land. All right, so you see how this whole system is being set up here. The nobles have the land to begin with. They have really a whole lot of land, too much for what they can ever use. They need people to work the land. So they give the land to the knights. The knights, in turn, will rent out portions of that land to peasants. The peasants will actually work the land for food. All right, so we're already beginning to see where this whole system is helping each other out. All right, now, a few other things as we go further along, okay? Nobles or lords, as they were called here, lords were the ones that had the land that basically gave it to the knights, and the knights in turn would be their vassals. So really in this whole system, nobles could be lords and they could also be vassals to the king and the queen. Okay, so vassal wasn't just reserved for the knights, it was just a term for someone or a group of people who had gotten a territory of land either from from a lord, either from a noble or one of the monarchs. Um, the nobles controlled everything on the land. When it came down to it, the nobles or the lords pretty much controlled everything in the territory. Now, as you get to the end of all this feudalism, and once you break it all down, then you really had, based off the system, what we had was kind of like small villages and towns, because on one chunk of land that was originally owned by the nobles, you had the nobles who had what was called a manor, or in some cases a castle, like a small castle, not like the big brick castles that we think of. Those are going to come later on in the Middle Ages, but maybe a small castle or a manor. You would have knights who would also have manors on the property, and then you would have the peasants and serfs that also live somewhere on the property. So you might have 10, 15, 20 acres where all these people are living off of the land. And it was in some cases like a small village. You might have a church, you might have other places to where these groups would actually correspond with each other. All right, so the nobles are going to control everything on the land, which means that they're also going to be responsible for resolving any kind of dispute. Okay, so the nobles, or the lords rather, are going to be the end all be all of the property. Okay, again, sometimes a king was a lord. And sometimes, if a knight, what happened is that knights could also turn into lords themselves, because the knights are going to have the land and the property, and what they're going to do is that they could actually become a lord as they gain more and more money. So you have a system set up here to where you could actually have knights be lords, you could have nobles be lords, you could have a king or a queen be lord. Again, the lord is the person that owns the land or the territory, that pretty much starts the whole system. And so knights, as you go further along, could actually get to the point to where they own their own land and could in turn be lords themselves. So same thing here. You could have knights that were vassals to the lord, and they could be their own lords to other peasants and serfs. Um, because when it came down to it, they needed someone to work the land. All right, now as far as the peasants go, peasants were people who were these were regular people. Okay, these were people who didn't have hardly any money. Again, most of society is going to fall into the peasants and serfs category, just like we've seen with most every other civilization this year. Okay, almost every other social structure, the general part of the population, ironically, is going to be in that bottom tier. Now, there are no slaves here. No slaves under this system of feudalism. And so, really, the peasants and the serfs would be at the very bottom of this social system. So, these were people that needed land. They needed food. Okay, so they needed land for food. They had no land, had no money for land. They get the land from the knights. What they would do is to pay the knights is that they would give the knights a portion of their food. All right, so the crops that were grown by the peasants, most of those crops would be given to the knights. And the knights would, in turn, allow the peasants to keep a portion of the land and a small portion of the crops to where the peasants could actually feed their families. So when it comes down to it, and we look at this whole system called feudalism, it's basically helping each other out. Is kind of a simple way to look at it. You have the people who have land but really have nobody to share it with. It's like having all kind of money and all these riches and all these goods, and it's just you by yourself. Okay, and at some point in time, you're going to need to share that with somebody. Let's say that you have a Lamborghini, which is my dream. But at some point in time, that Lamborghini is going to have to be worked on. It's going to have to be serviced. It's going to break down. Same thing if I have 40 or 50 acres of farmland and yet it's just me, I need somebody to work that land. And so that's exactly what we have here is that you have a land or a property here to where nobles for the most part, have a good bit of land, but they can't work it by themselves. So they give a portion of the land to the knights. In turn, the knights are basically in a contract with the nobles for protection. Anytime the nobles went into battle, anytime that the nobles needed protection, the knights are right there to help them out. So the knights are giving protection and service to the lords in return for the land. Also, part of the lord's responsibility was that they should also provide protection for everybody else, or rather, protect everybody else. To where if you have a knight or a group of knights that are attacked, then the Lord, according to that contract, is supposed to protect them. And so basically, because the nobles controlled everything and basically was control of the entire property, that it was also their responsibility to protect the knights, and in some cases even to protect the peasants and the serfs if there was any kind of a foreign attack. And so that's what you have here. Again, very similar to the social systems that we've talked about so far this year, but very unique here in that it's a system designed to help everybody in some way. There was a system to where you might have some groups able to actually move up the ladder. Again, it was very common for many knights to gain more and more land, and in return, they would become a lord themselves. And so this was a system set up to where you could somewhat actually move up the ladder here. And so this is a very simple system, but feudalism which is what this is going to be very important to European society as we go through the Middle Ages and as we get into modern world history. This system is not necessarily going to be around like this, but the whole idea uh, of of nobles, aristocrats, knights, vassals, peasants, and serfs. This whole social structure is still going to be set up as we get into modern world history in the 15 and 1600s. This really um, sets Europe apart from any other continents in how their social system is set up. Now, in finishing this all up, there's one more thing that I want to talk about before we wrap up for the chapter. If we look at section 4, then we see the same thing happening in Japan. Okay, there are a lot of similarities in between Europe and Japan. And we did not get a chance to go back and do chapter 16, or rather chapter 15, which was about Japan. Okay, where we left off before the break is that we had just taken the test on chapter 14, which was with China. Chapter 15 was about Japan. So we didn't really get into the whole aspect of Japan, but very quickly here, you take chapter 16 and chapter 17, and there are a lot of similarities here. So we're going to take just a few minutes here to compare and contrast European society here, mostly feudalism, along with that in Japan, to wrap up this chapter. And we're going to do that with what's called a Venn diagram. Okay. All right, so very quickly, some of the things we talked about so far. Okay, the whole system of feudalism under Europe, you have a king, nobles, lords, knights, or vassals, and then peasants and serfs. For Japan, okay, Japan also has feudalism as well. Well, which is really strange because when you think about the time period here, it's not like today to where we have all this communication, all this technology in regards to email and social media and the news outlets, to where really we can learn about different societies just by watching the TV. But you're still talking about society here to where, keep in mind, Europe doesn't even have the printing press yet, which means that they don't even have a way to circulate newspapers about their own territories, much less what's happening in Japan. So you have two different civilizations here that's half a world apart that really has the same social system. And again, the fact that neither one knew about the other was pretty important here. So in Japan, you had the same system of feudalism. Instead of a king, you would have an emperor. Okay, you would have lords as well. In Japan, they were called daimyo. Daimyo. So they were called nobles in Europe. They were called daimyo in Japan. Instead of knights, Japanese would have samurai. Okay, and that was the Japanese version of the knights. And of course, as well, peasants and serfs. So you had really similar here in between feudalism in Europe and feudalism in Japan, pretty much the same exact system here. So when we look at the similarities, first one is that they both had feudalism, which again is pretty amazing because you have two civilizations that barely know that each other exists, but yet they have the same kind of social structure of helping each other out. Now, where things get a little different here is that mostly in regards to the arts. Before I get to that, one more thing here with this system here. With knights and vassals, there is a certain kind of code that they would have called chivalry. Okay, chivalry was the code of conduct for the knights. All right. On the other hand, samurai had what was called bushido. Same thing, that was the code for the samurai. All right, so when we put these two together, both chivalry and bushido were very, very similar, because what it came down to was that these were qualities and characteristics that both knights and samurais were expected to have, such as they were expected to be brave, they were expected to be loyal to the nobles, to the daimyo, to the king, to the emperor. They were supposed to be humble and modest. And as well as kind to others, especially to women. So what you have here is the code of conduct for knights, the code of conduct for samurai, which are very similar. There was a certain characteristic that they were supposed to have in order to be in that category. It wasn't for everybody. It was for the most experienced, bravest soldiers, but also had to take those characteristics and had to be someone that was a pretty high quality. All right. Where the differences come in between Europe and Japan is really going to come in the arts. For Europe, you have pretty much, I'm going to say Christianity here, but really it's talking about the Catholic Church. And I talked about this in the last video. If you didn't see the last video, I've said this in class before, that when you put Christianity in its truest sense down into a list and then look at the qualities of the Catholic Church, really they're two different things, okay? I know that they're both rooted in the ideas of Christianity, and I know that sparks all kind of controversy. Many people believe that Catholicism is the same thing as Christianity, but when you look at, again, when you break them down side by side, then they really are two different things. A lot of similarities, but they really are two different things. Okay, the Pope is the ruler of the Catholic Church, but no other Christian church answers to the Pope. Okay, so again, I categorize Catholicism as something that's a little different than what we consider as Christianity today. So, and again, during the Middle Ages in Europe, when you hear the word Christianity, it's really referring to the Catholic Church. Okay, so in Europe, it's all about the Catholic Church, and religion here is going to play a key part in literature and the arts. So all of your major artwork, statues, temples, literature, all that is based around, or at least most of that is based around religion, which is going to go back to the Catholic Church. Okay, Catholic popes, bishops, archbishops, and things to do with the Catholic Church. Whereas in Japan, it had to do with aspects of Buddhism, Shinto, what it's called, as well as Confucianism. And we talked about Buddhism and Confucianism a good bit. Shinto is back in chapter 15. That was one of your vocab words. So you should know a little bit about Shinto as well. Again, a belief system in Japan. And so whereas most of the literature and arts in Europe was based around religion and the Catholic Church, in Japan it was based around nature. All right, so we do have a lot of similarities here in between European culture and Japanese culture during the Middle Ages. Both had the system of feudalism. Both had this honor system in between knights and samurai and the entire social structure. And so a lot of similarities here. And so that brings us really to the end of chapter 17. This is very quick, very brief, very to the point, but really that's what it's based around, is very to the point. So chapter 18, we get into the second part of the Middle Ages. We continue with the Middle Ages and talk more about the kind of Knights of the Round Table kind of Middle Ages that we're used to. Okay, so I will see you guys next week, and we'll get into chapter 18.